We've recently witnessed exploding pagers, sequential assassination attempts on a Republican candidate running for president. Unfortunately, they failed. And then our government's current effort now to convince their political allies in big tech to censor the people, like probably you and I, who disagree with the establishment, or at least whatever the currently in vogue political establishment narrative might be right now. Now, these just seem like crazy times in which we live. And this, of course, just fuels a growing concern that many of us have about an age of rage and kind of an attempt to whip up angry people into a frenzy of violence against fellow citizens just because they don't like perhaps how they vote or maybe what they believe or the politicians that they support. Now, this is clearly a problem and a growing concern for those of us engaged in exercising free speech, particularly in a public format. Now, before I get into the violence, the rage, the free speech, and other drama that we're witnessing today, please don't forget to hit the subscribe and the like button down below. And I know that about 40% of the viewers watching this video right now, that might include you, have not hit that subscribe button down below, even though it costs you nothing except a few seconds of your time. The more subscribers that we can actually have as a channel, the more visible our videos become for others to find. Also, if you think I've missed something, or if you may disagree with me, please feel free to leave your comments down below as well. I do try to read everything, and I often respond to those of you who do leave comments. You can also easily share this video if you like it, and you can share with your friends, maybe your political enemies. You never know who would appreciate a different perspective from the captured corporate media that we seem to have more often today. Okay, now back to the crazy world in which we live. America is not immune to political violence, even if it seems we've been pretty sheltered over recent years from the violence that we've witnessed perhaps in other countries around maybe political processes in those countries over the years. As Americans, we're pretty much unlikely to be run over by tanks anytime soon, but the increasing violence directed at a presidential candidate should be concerning to more people than just Republican supporters of Trump. 2 serious attempts in less than 2 months. That does seem like an unusual escalation of what appears to be crazed leftists acting out their MSNBC or maybe crazed college professors' kind of worst fantasies in real life. And when you consider and convince enough of your followers that electing Trump's going to be the end of democracy, then you're probably going to have a few of the more unhinged people out there who are willing or become willing to save democracy by then killing Trump. Now, of course, they apparently will only do this after making their Act Blue financial contributions to the Democrat politicians that they support. The most recent guy who actually tried to take out Trump even left a letter here behind that was claiming that he would pay $150,000 to whoever finished the job, which he failed to finish himself. Now, I'm really not sure how motivating that payout would be, considering the fact that the guy who did it is in custody today and claims he has no money. But the sane thoughts appear just rarely to be found on the left today whenever we're talking about subjects like this. What is really weird about some of this political violence is the pretense that that basically whatever's left of our declining legacy media, it's kind of this pretense how they kind of bend over backwards to pretend that these acts of violence are not political in nature, or at least not leftist inspired, even when they clearly are happening on that side of the political spectrum. The attempted assassination of Steve Scalise and the fellow Republicans just a few years ago by a crazed Bernie Sanders supporter was just one example. The corrupted media still wants to memory hole that entire mass assassination attempt and then pretend it wasn't political even after the Bernie Sanders supporter who committed the violence confirmed with bystanders that his targets were Republicans before he started taking his shots. Now, this appears to have been a warm-up act to what we're witnessing today, just a few years later. The second failed attempt to murder Trump by a hardcore leftist who, just like the first failed assassin just a few weeks earlier, who, of course, also donated to Democrat candidates using Act Blue. In this recent case, the guy had actually made these contributions at least 19 times. And then he also proudly sported a Biden-Harris sticker on his truck. I mean, this is really an attempt of the establishment media to cover up these facts or pretend they just aren't true. And it's just as troubling because their cover-up, I believe, also encourages more of this behavior in the future. Now, I'm sure that this is all just coincidental. I mean, maybe Act Blue will cooperate and pre-scrub their accounts from the FEC, just like they seem to change so much else on the FEC website once you start looking at it. Perhaps a future assassin's going to scrape off that bumper sticker right here next time a little bit in advance. But a recent poll that was released by the University of Chicago is actually more concerning because it clearly found that 26 million Americans believe that the use of force is justified to keep Trump from regaining the presidency. And those are going to be pretty much mostly Democrats or leftists, by the way. Now, that's a lot of people on our college campuses, working in government agencies, and elsewhere who openly admit that they support violence against their fellow citizens to obtain their political goals and objectives. Now, worse than this, I believe, however, is just the fact that the traditional media who seem to focus on excusing or justifying this type of violent behavior, so long as they support the cause that's supported by the violence. We saw the same attempt by our co-opted media to cover up violent crimes during the mass BLM Antifa protests of 2020, to the point that the media was widely mocked by many people for pretending that the massive destruction, the death, and the violence caused by organized leftist groups in all these cities around America was mostly peaceful. And they quickly pretended that the assaults on the police, the arson, and the looting, and the destruction of the cities was really not worth discussing. Now, the media deserved every name and mockery that they got at that time, but they seem to continuously double down now on dishonesty rather than become honest reporters. Even when many city blocks, for example, of Seattle were occupied by leftist groups, which directly led to the death of several people and the formal suspension of law and order within the occupied zone at Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, our political and media establishment really just wanted to pretend that this wasn't as extreme or violent as it clearly was. Our Washington State Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who now wants to be governor, and Jay Inslee himself, who was pretending to be governor at the time, they just looked the other way and they pretended that it wasn't happening. Now, America has experienced political violence and unrest before. The pre-Civil War America was filled with violent eras in Kansas and elsewhere, where anti- and pro-slavery political views were openly fought by supporters of each political movement, violently against each other's supporters at the time. Many died then as a direct result of this political violence. Now, in that same era, we even witnessed politicians assaulting each other in the very halls of Congress. The post-Reconstruction South, after America's most violent era, of course, obviously in the 1860s, during the Civil War itself, the post-Reconstruction was not without some horrific examples of post-Civil War political violence as well. As I've discussed actually in previous videos about the Colfax Massacre, where Democrats massacred Republicans, most of them former slaves, for actually daring to question the very questionable elections that were happening in that community at the time. And now, of course, there was the era of the anarchists, kind of in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and their brand of political assassination and violence around the dawn of the 20th century. This also led to a successful Republican presidential assassination plot at the time when an anarchist actually killed Republican President McKinley. And now, well, anarchists in America later became this foundation of the growing socialist and communist movement in America. Their political assassinations kind of dropped off for a few years after quite an impressive streak of taking out the politicians that they exposed or opposed in America and in Europe at that time. Now then we had the 1960s and 70s when political violence was once again in vogue with successful assassinations of the president, presidential candidates, civil rights leaders, and others during a time of protests, sometimes very violent protests throughout our nation. Now, all of this history was before my time, of course, and it was probably before your time as well. I mean, I was old enough to kind of remember the attempt to kill Reagan in 1981. I was just a kid, and that was shocking enough. But today we seem to be approaching just another episode, perhaps like these times in the past. Now, one failure of the current collapsing public educational system in our country is this total failure to actually teach history at all. And so it seems, unfortunately, that we're going to be destined to repeat the mistakes and the horror of previous generations, just probably out of ignorance and the inevitable fallen nature of man, which, of course, usually leads to disaster of some kind when ignorance becomes the default condition of the general population. Now, the media has always played a role in these times of unrest and violence. Free speech has usually been protected and supported by the media, at least in recent times. But since we are in an era when the majority of the media leans left, they have apparently decided to abandon free speech now, and as a general belief. Now, this is a problem because instead of advocating for an effort to kind of silence those with whom they disagree, and instead they justify the rage and, of course, they ignore the violence of those with whom they agree. Remember, misinformation is just a term that's used to describe any statement which counteracts the government's preferred narrative, which our corporate media is going to be determined to support at all costs, even if it changes the next day. I mean, this is a challenge that we, as regular concerned citizens, perhaps not part of the 26 million polled left-leaning Americans who justify violence to stop Trump from being elected again, but who actually support free speech and prefer free political activism instead. We face a real challenge right now from what I've seen of political violence in history. It rarely remains one-sided, and I'm a little concerned that that is the point of much of the violence that we see today, to inspire some type of retaliation. We really do want to avoid political violence as a widespread and justified and excused behavior to flourish in our country, even if the traditional media seems to be encouraging it. Now, regardless of those who believe that their political side is going to succeed or flourish from the political violence, I really tend to believe that the consequences of full-blown violence, like what we've witnessed in other countries, it will not end well for many of those who, for some reason, seem to believe that it's acceptable behavior. However, I also believe that one path to resist and stop this violence is through the unhindered use of free speech. And this is why I'm very concerned about, and of course I strongly oppose, the efforts of the established media, the government, or our high-tech kingpins today of using their power to silence those of us who disagree with them. Now, I believe suppression of people's ability to speak, organize, communicate, and peacefully oppose the violence that we're witnessing today, I believe that this could ultimately lead to far worse outcomes than what we've seen so far. The hypocrisy of the anti-free speech movement is also a bit breathtaking for those who are paying attention. I mean, we saw Hillary Clinton here recently just go on TV, and then during her interview, she wanted to criminally charge American citizens, essentially imprison them, for online speech with which she disagrees. Now, of all people who have spread misinformation in our country, Hillary Clinton may take the cake for the fake misinformation hoaxes she has spread, like the debunked Russian collusion lie or the fake dossier or other scams. I mean, by her own logic, assuming that there's some modicum of logic here at all in Clinton land, she would be demanding that Clinton herself be criminally charged for her many false statements in the past. Now, I'm sure she doesn't consider this because she presumes, correctly I expect, that she is exempt from the rules that she wants to impose on the rest of us peasants and deplorables. But back to political violence and free speech. A few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to MC the Washington State Republican Dinner event in Bellevue. The keynote speaker was Riley Gaines, who was the talented NCAA national swimming champion who was denied a trophy and experienced the politically correct weirdness of giving that woman's trophy to a man who was basically pretending to be a woman at the time. Now, I'd heard her story before, but I hadn't heard the story about one of her original attempts to speak about her experience at the San Francisco State University campus, and the lefty activist who assaulted her, shut down her presentation, and then who held her hostage for 4 hours, demanding that she pay the money before she was released. Now, this extortion attempt to silence her appears to have been pivotal in convincing her to become an outspoken activist for women's sports, but also to resist the attempt of our media and culture to silence her. Now, one thing she pointed out when discussing this experience was the fact that the college itself actually came out and justified, excused, and in fact, they praised the violence that was inflicted on her at the time, which inevitably, this is only going to lead to worse outcomes in the future. Not only was Riley silenced and assaulted by the mob, but all who disagreed with the leftist worldview on that campus have clearly been silenced because that school administration will encourage and support violence against anyone else who dares to speak up. Now, this is how free speech suppression and political violence are linked together, I believe. Now, I suspect that the ongoing efforts to silence those of us willing to speak truth to power or question authority or challenge the government-approved media talking points, I suspect that these efforts will backfire in the end and produce a much stronger movement to expose the truth and confront the corrupt than what we would otherwise experience in the near future. But on the way to this inevitable outcome, things can really get messy and ugly. And this is because, well, some people are easily intimidated and threatened by the left and their allies. Not everybody's going to cave. Not everybody's going to timidly sneak back to their comfortable world in the mistaken and, of course, foolish belief that if they will only go silent, they'll be safe. Past experience indicates that the path of timidity will not produce the change that you and I and many others who actually care about freedom and liberty that we truly want. Timidity is not going to restore freedom of speech. Timidity will not stop those in the media who are whipping up the next assassin, even as I speak. And I suspect that timidity will not stop the effort by those who crave power and enjoy their ability to abuse that power to force others to conform. People who are outing themselves as the petty tyrants they are and who actively suppress the truth and encourage the violence against their perceived political opponents, they clearly will not be stopped by the timid compromisers who just promise to please just leave them alone. Again, you may hate the political process, but the political process and all the ways that it's manifested in our country, it will interest itself in you eventually. And this is why we must continue our efforts to expose the truth as far and wide as we can. But we also have to recognize that there are basic policies and actions that we must inevitably take in the future to maintain our free speech without political violence. And I hope this is the type of world that we all desire to see today. First, when we recognize that organizations have become hostile to free speech, we must oppose those organizations. We have to call them out for their hostility to free speech and also stop supporting them financially. Colleges like the San Francisco State University, they should be denied government funding if they're so willing to support violence and the suppression of free speech. I mean, there are plenty of colleges in America, and letting the worst schools fail and disappear due to their insane and crazy suppression of freedom, that's going to help reduce the type of behavior, I believe, in the future. This is also true with universities like the University of Washington, where, unfortunately, they've cultivated, funded, and organized censorship operations in coordination with tech companies, organizations that then support suppressing free speech, like this, should have all federal funds removed, I believe. I mean, taxpayers should not be subsidizing the destruction of their constitutional freedoms, and all federal funding must be removed from these types of organizations when they take this type of approach. Now, secondly, there is a growing alternative media, and we see it growing all the time, and it seems likely to explode and expand in size. And this is inevitable, I believe, not just at the national level, but at the local level as well. One of the reasons I believe that the traditional legacy media is largely on life support right now, and basically this eternal effort to collapse, has basically been this hostility that they've had to the concept of free speech. And then there's just endless support for growing authoritarian tendencies to then eliminate debate, silence opposing thoughts, suppressing free speech, among lots of other bad behavior. It's naive, I think, to believe that the media must be neutral. We have often had biased media of various types over the last few centuries, but we can't have the media monopoly be exclusively one-sided the way that it is today. And this bias is already encouraging the creation of local and national media operations in various forms that I believe will remain focused on the truth and expose the stories that our traditional legacy media mostly tries to cover up today. More significantly, the alternative media will also inevitably cover the stories that our political media establishment won't even explore due to political expediency and the groupthink that they participate in. And finally, I believe that political violence is a creature of ignorance and frustration and rage. Sure, the political violence is whipped up by one side of the political spectrum today, but it could be different tomorrow. It is easiest to basically counter the violent rhetoric if free speech is allowed to flourish. And this is why I believe that we must have more free speech, not less. However, we also need to restore consequences for real violence, not imaginary microaggressions or hurt feelings, but genuine violence. People who believe that taking it to the street and then burning down a city or attempting to capture parts of a city and then turn these into lawless zones, there really does need to be some type of real consequences for this type of violent behavior. Otherwise, we're just going to inevitably see more of this, and it will only get more violent and worse than it was before. If only the people who commit an act of protest in D.C. and wander the halls of government for a few minutes are to be imprisoned like this grandma here, And yet the violent thousands who assaulted, murdered, and burned their way through American cities a few months earlier are just allowed to commit those crimes with complete and total impunity. Then we are allowing our government to craft a very clear and obvious double standard. Just like my free speech concerns, it's only likely to lead to more violence in the future, and that's not a good thing. Now is not the time, though, to hide away, just hoping that nobody notices you. Now is actually the time to peacefully engage and organize with others and find those with whom you disagree, and then come up with local projects on which you can actually report the truth and perhaps share the truth, and ultimately work with the teams of others who actually care about the truth. But to do this, you have to show up. And it does take a lot of thankless hard work, but in the end, I believe that you can change things for the better. As the legacy, kind of traditional media ends up crumbling and then disappears, we will need to be ready to fill the void and vacuum of the media. We will need to exercise our free speech, and hopefully we can avoid more political violence in the future by doing this. But it will require us to show up to make these changes, because the future belongs to those who show up.